A big case dealing with lower receivers as we see some other cases moving through concerning litigation against gun regulations. Good morning. You can always find me anywhere. Just search Bishop on Air and we can connect that way. Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, just search Bishop on Air. So the federal ATF, they had a rule on frames and receivers and a lawsuit that was brought by the Firearms Policy Coalition. They essentially got a pretty big victory late last week where a federal judge vacated the ATF's rule on frames and receivers. And if you're not familiar with, litigation lingo, vacating something means disposing of it, getting rid of it. A summary judgment was issued in this case. So the judge wrote that this case presents the question of whether the federal government may lawfully regulate partially manufactured firearms components, related firearm products, and other tools and materials in keeping with the Gun Control Act of 1968. Because the court concludes the government cannot regulate those items without violating federal law, the court holds the government's recently enacted final rule is unlawful agency action taken in excess of the ATF statutory jurisdiction. On this basis, the court vacates that final rule. So the Firearms Policy Coalition says that they're thrilled the court agreed the ATF's frame or receiver rule exceeds the agency's congressional limited authority. With the decision, the court has properly struck down ATF's rule and ensured that it cannot enforce that which it never had the authority to publish in the first place. This is a monumental victory against the tyrannical ATF. Firearms Policy Coalition says. So other instances here on this story, you've got a headline saying federal court delivers blow to ATF's ban on, quote, ghost guns. And what are we talking about here? We're talking about lower receivers and whether or not they're fully finished or if they're 80% finished. And you can go online and actually find places to purchase these. It's a chunk of metal, and you can essentially get a 3D printer to, finish it off and to make that 80% lower receiver 100% and operational to where, that's the part where the cartridge gets into the barrel and the action happens and ultimately allows for the projectile to move out and fire. So this case is a pretty big win for Second Amendment advocates when it comes to the question of what kind of regulations can be crafted by rule, because this wasn't something that Congress passed into law. This was something that Congress had no hand in. And instead, the Biden administration with the ATF crafted this rule. Now, how this impacts Illinois in particular, I've still got to go and do some research because Illinois did pass a measure that limits the availability of these, quote, so-called ghost guns. But I'm interested to see, I got to dig back into that bill and see if it specifically outlines, these lower receivers that are unfinished, if those are regulated, or if they just simply say that they're going to take what the ATF has in their rules and implement that in Illinois. Which you see that a lot of times in state laws. They will say, whatever the federal policy is what the state policy is. So I still got to delve into that and find out how this court ruling down in Texas impacts Illinois. But again, the headline is federal court delivers blow to ATF's ban on ghost guns. It's not clear if the Department of Justice is going to appeal the case. They haven't made any public comments about it yet, but ultimately, with the rule being vacated and summary judgment being granted in that case, it's a pretty big deal. But then you also have the U.S. Supreme Court agreeing to take up a review of various rulings striking down domestic violence federal gun ban. So essentially, you've got if somebody's involved in domestic violence previously, do they have or do they not have a right to the Second Amendment? And these are obviously some cases that we're seeing all across the country. So the U.S. Supreme Court has agreed that they will take that up a year after a pretty sweeping ruling on New York State Rifle Association versus Bruin. So a lot of movement in court when it comes to gun litigation. let alone what we had last week in Illinois, where you had a appeals court hear the case consolidated, challenging Illinois' gun and magazine ban. And that case is now under review by the appellate courts, and a lot of questions as to if that's going to be fully resolved before that January 1st deadline in Illinois for people to register their previously owned firearms that fit into the category of the Protect Illinois Communities Act, which is being challenged in federal court. So we'll obviously keep an eye on whenever that ruling comes out and whether or not there's going to be a totally separate lawsuit about the Fifth Amendment allegations that a registry violates an individual's Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination. Now, why do we have these particular laws in not just Illinois, but elsewhere throughout the country? Because politicians, they are reacting to what they see as a growing problem of mass shootings. We're going to see the year anniversary of the Highland Park mass shooting tomorrow, and that's a year ago where you had a gunman get on top of a rooftop and open fire. I think he let off like 80-plus rounds, killed 7 and dozens of injured during a Independence Day parade in Highland Park. Highland Park had an assault weapons ban in place. And still, that didn't keep a deranged individual from opening fire on a crowd of people. But also, when you dig into the Highland Park case, the suspect in the case, he had multiple interactions with law enforcement. Like 2 years before the Highland Park shooting last year, the suspect was visited by police because of family having concerns he was going to harm himself or others. They confiscated knives. They even sent Illinois State Police a clear and present danger report on this individual. And this individual, despite that, was able to get a firearm owner identification card that Illinoisans are required to have if they want to purchase or own firearms or ammunition. And even with that clear and present danger report in place, Illinois State Police still gave the FOID card to this individual, and he was able to legally purchase these weapons and allegedly go and open fire on that crowd in Highland Park. So, when you have reactions to limit the availability of firearms for law-abiding citizens because of the actions of others, that is not necessarily a way to have some buy-in, I guess you could say, from individuals. And there's a lot of focus and discussion about, well, how do we handle these things? Well, I don't know if more gun laws are going to do it, because even in a state which has substantial gun laws that gun control groups give an A grade to, you had a shooting in Baltimore. 28 people injured, 2 dead, and this after what seemed to be like a block party that popped up 12:30 in the morning. You had multiple suspects open fire, a mass shooting, 28 shot, and 2 killed. No arrests have been made yet from the latest reporting I've seen. You also had a shooting in Kansas that left 7 people with gunshot wounds at a nightclub. So, how do we get after this rather than trying to stack on more gun legislation and more gun laws on law-abiding people while trying to curb this type of violence? Is there something more deep? Because when you see these shootings happen across the country, if it's like in a state like Texas or like in Florida, these gun control groups will say, see, there needs to be more gun control in that state. But then when it happens in a state like Massachusetts, which these gun control groups give an A grade to, they say, oh, it's a complicated issue. Well, okay, we can all agree it's a complicated issue. How do we get to the crux of it without having so-called collateral damage of law-abiding people not being able to exercise their rights? It's a balancing act that it's tough to maintain, but obviously the courts are there to have to deal with these things whenever these types of questions are raised. All right, 217-629-7970. We do have a phone call coming in. Let's go ahead and grab that. Good morning. You're on WMAY.
Morning, Bishop.
Hey.
Yeah, a couple of things. As far as that domestic violence one goes, I hope the Supreme Court passes that one. Years ago, I had a girlfriend. I pushed her aside, no gun involved. I can't own a firearm now. And now I've got a 12-year-old daughter. We've got coyotes in our backyards, raccoons on our front porch growling at her, and I can't pop them.
Yeah.
And then as far as the gun laws go, and I work 2 jobs. I'm 65 years old. not as young as I used to be. But as far as the shootings and stuff goes, we're lacking biblical values as to, treating other people with respect, the guidances of that alcohol is basically violence, which it is. I used to be a bartender and a partier, but it's just lack of respect. And, the Bible teaches us to do what God wants us to do, not to just go do what we want to do because it gets us in trouble.
Well, and I think there's a lot to say about morality in society. For instance, you can even just boil it down to the lack of focus on the nuclear family, right? A mother and a father living in a house with children. They have role models to look up to. They have life lessons that can be taught to them. But if they don't have that structure in their household, then you could see some problems arising. I appreciate the call. All right. We'll obviously be talking a lot more about this. It's a topic that, 2.4 million Illinoisans have a FOID card, so obviously they're interested in what the gun laws are and the various challenges there are, not just in Illinois, but across the country. So it will be an ongoing topic that we cover here with Springfield's Morning News. I'm Greg Bishop on 92.7 WMAY, Springfield's News and Talk. Follow Bishop on Air anywhere, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. Just search Bishop on Air, and we can connect that.